Dimension or dimensions, whatever you might want to call it. It refers to measurement of the size in terms of the length, the width, the height, the radius, the diameter, name it. It's pretty easy. So in this video, we are going to cover 7 tips that you must know in order to save time as you dimension in Archicad. My name is Namara Alan and welcome to Nalitech Studio. If you are new to this channel, I recommend that you subscribe below, hit this like button, and let's get started with this. Alright, tip number 1, and that is dimension settings. So there are 2 kinds of settings that you might want to watch out for. So the first one is setting up the units in which you are going to work. And the other kind of settings is the actual settings where you go to determine how the dimensions should look like. So let's begin with the one for units. So you want to go to Options, Project Preferences, and choose Dimensions. So when this dialog box is up, you have this different kind of dimensions that are presented to you. We have linear dimensions, angular, you have radial, you have level, and then you also have elevations. Now, and these others. So in our case, we are going to discuss these 4. We are going to discuss linear dimensions, angular dimensions, radial dimensions, and elevational dimensions. So you want to go ahead and choose which units you want to work with depending on what you are going to include in your drawing. So in our case, we have meters here, so you can change to any that you feel comfortable working with. And in my case, I like to use millimeters. You can choose whatever you like to use. And because of using millimeters, decimals may not make much sense. So you check that to 0. Now in angular dimensions, we have decimal degrees, which I believe most of you would want to stay as degrees, and then you choose also 0 decimals or any number of decimals that you wish to see. Now in the radial dimensions, you can change to any the other that you want, but because I want my drawings to be uniform, you can use millimeters and then also set them to 0 because points are not going to mean any much. Now in elevation, finally, we can also change to millimeters and 0 and say OK. Now, the second part of this dimension setting is you have the settings, and which you can get by hitting Ctrl+T or just clicking on this icon, which is here, and you will have these dimensions. Just make sure that this dimension document is selected. In the dimension settings here, this is where things start to get interesting, because in here you decide how you want to personalize and make your dimensions look like. Because in here you decide how long the witness lines are going to be, how your font is going to be. So the first things that I would like you to leave the way they are is to leave these ones. The defaults are really okay. For example, checking something like static dimension is going to be problematic because you want the dimensions to be associated to a wall. So if you move that wall, the dimension sticks with it. But if you tick that static dimension, it is not going to be associative. So we want to use this first option. We want to keep and choose another, like a style that we like. Maybe we can use an arrow or something else, but I can leave that for preference. And that's what I told you about these settings here. You can make a preference and have maybe the drawings that come from your farm look a certain way because of such settings. Personally, in the witness lines, I prefer something that has shorter witness lines, and that's because when you start to dimension after dimension, they tend to overlap these witness lines and they can look a little bit messy. So it's also a preference, but you can also choose any other that you like from there. So from here is where you choose the font. I can choose any other apart from the area that is default. So you here you start to determine, and the font that you choose is going to also make your drawings look different. And in here you can also decide how big this is. Even in the text style you can make them bold or something like that. But the rule of thumb really in this dimension setting is that you want a font that is legible, a font, because you might have issues with your contractor on site if he cannot read your drawing because of the font size that you chose. You also don't want it to shout and overshadow the actual design of the building, so make sure that you balance those. Once you have that in mind and you choose your preferences, and maybe just you can also make it opaque such that anything beneath the figures is not shown, such that the figures are really legible, and you say okay. That leads us to tip number 2. Alright, tip number 2 is placement of the dimensions. So once you have everything set up, you want to start to dimension. And make sure that in the geometry method you have something like this selected or like that, because then it will be easier for you to place the dimension. All you do is click the first point and click the next point that you want to dimension and double click on the outside and place. So that is it about placing. Along the way we are going to discuss how you can dimension when things are at an angle or when things are circular. Alright, so that leads us to tip number 3. How to auto dimension. So all you want to do is click on the mark U sign, click on the first point, or hover over the drawing and click on the next point. So you have that highlighted, and then just click wall tool and select all walls, because we definitely want the walls to be selected. If you had columns in your design, you would select those such that they can be dimensioned. So all you want to do is go to document, annotations, and click automatic dimension and select exterior dimensions. So when that is selected, we have a few options here we can work with. First of all, it shows you what dimensions are going to be given to you. We have the dimensions for the openings, then the structure, external geometry, and the overall, which is ideal for dimensioning. And you can also choose any of these. If you have, for example, composite walls, you can choose to dimension only the cores as opposed to the outside faces. I'll leave everything the way they are, but make sure that you check this place dimension on 4 sides. The dimension will appear in 4 sides, and then also the distance between the lines is by default around 500, but you can choose anything between 500 and 1 meter. So you can say okay, and then you can click on the outside and specify where your first dimension is going to be. And yeah, it is already placed. Let's first be this one that we created first. So this is a fast way to create dimensions, and I personally find this helpful in terms when I have a clean drawing that has nothing like a lot of things going on, but it can get a little messy when you're dealing with a lot of things in your model. So make sure that you cross-check, but I still think that it does a pretty good job if you look at how it dimensions. But of course it has some issues. For example, it is dimensioning this wall which is 200, and then also adding in this interior one, which is making this 150, which is not ideal, is not something that you would do personally if you were to do this manually. So you have to watch out for such things, but I think overall it does a pretty good job. And if you are out of time, which most of the times we are, it is a great one that you can throw in and have things dimensioned. And it can also work for interior dimensions. So just as I said before, you can say mark you this thing and then go to wall, Control A to select all the walls, then go to the document and say annotations, and then you say automatic dimensioning and choose interior dimensions for now. So you can say okay to these things which are here, and then decide where the dimension line is going to be. For example, in here, I think a dimension through here is pretty important. So you specify a line across that, and then you double click on the final point, and then you decide where the next click will be where you place it, and say okay when you place it there. So when you do place it there, you can see that whichever structure is being crossed is being dimensioned. And this leads us to tip number 4. How to edit dimensions. So assuming that you want to add some points to this dimension, which is typical and you would want to do it sometimes, so you have this selected, and then you can add points to it by going to where you want and control clicking. So for example, this wall, I can control click and there it is added. Pretty easy to do. So for example, here I can decide also to add this other point and this other point. So just select and control click. So let's try an example like this one, and let's automatic dimensioning. Looking at such a design, some dimensions are not going to be that important. So now like this, really, something dimensioned along here would be more important. So how do we edit such a dimension? For example, we can decide that this dimension should be broken into 2. So you can decide, for example, this point is right here. We can decide to select this point, and then we click and we will have this pet palette from which we can choose. So we can decide to, for example, divide it from here or trim it, whichever you choose, or move that point. So let's for example, trim it on that such that that is trimmed. So this one we can Control D to drag it and bring it maybe closer to this angular wall, and then we can also reorient this dimension instead of redoing the same thing. So just zoom in and hover over the dimension string and then click, and then you will have this pet palette. Now in this pet palette is where you have what you can do with this thing. Now you can reorient the second option. So if you choose that, you can now decide where you want to reorient. For example, when that appears, you can reorient to this wall, and look at that, it just does the work for you. So let's do the same thing for this one more example. Just grab this node, actually not that one but this one, which we want to disassociate from the entire chain. Click it, and then we cut it, so to say, and then we drag it closer, hover over there, just click, and then when that appears, choose that, and then you make sure that you have this inverted Y or Mercedes-Benz sign, and then you click there and it is done. So another thing that you might want to do with this is remove a dimension. For example, we have the same dimension here and here, so you can decide, I don't want this dimension right here. Click, you just hold Control and click, and it disappears. So now you don't have that repetition. But if you want to keep it as well, and maybe you accidentally removed it, you can shift click this one to select it, and then holding Control, click this other one, and they will be joined. And that will also work if, for example, you had this one. Let's undo that and move it a bit. You had this one offset from it. So, and if you had something like that and you wanted this to join to that, so you just shift click to have that one, and then Control click to align that, and it will be well aligned. And you can as well, for example, if you want it joined, but because there's repetition here, maybe in this one you can decide to dimension from here all the way to there. So you can also get an individual point there, delete it, and it's gone. So right now you have this dimension and that dimension. So you can go ahead and edit that. So it's what I like to do. Just have the automatic dimension do this, and then I can go in and polish it to look how I want it to be. So this leads us to tip number 5. Tip number 5 is going to be about circular dimension. So where do we find circular dimension? So under More, you can find the circular dimension right there. So here is where you can determine how it is going to be represented. So like we did before, you can go into the settings, and the defaults are pretty good. So let's try and put this thing in here. So all you have to do is just click on the first point, click on the second one, and the dimension is placed. And because we already set the units, this is pretty good. So we can also click here, and it is well placed. And that is it about the radial dimension. But what if you want to dimension the arc length as opposed to just the radius? So you can decide to dimension the arc length by going back to the previous one we had. So document, have the dimension selected, and this time you can change to arc length. So when arc length is selected, you can hover over the wall you want to do, just click it, and it will show you that it's dimensioning from this point to that point. Double click, and you can now decide where to put it. So that's how you dimension, and then you can add in more points like we discussed before. So Control click to add this position of these windows. So easy to do, just Control click and you have added those windows. Pretty easy to do. You can also move this maybe by Control D to drag it, but then also when you click it, it also has the options that we talked about. You can even split them and offset them as you want. Now this leads us to tip number 6. So angular dimensions, I think I prefer angular dimensions as opposed to the arc length, because in real world, how is someone going to actually come in and measure this? So I can give in some guidelines. For example, I go to the line tool and start to draw some lines. So let me get the center by hovering over here, and I draw some center lines instead, sorry. So let's grab a center line, and then we place it in here like so. Just make sure that you're getting the correct point, and instead of redoing, I can just, copy that, because I believe these are the same windows. Control E to rotate this to here. And instead of giving you those, I'd prefer someone just coming, and this is how you dimension angles, is you go to here more, if you have 23, and get this angular thing. So with this one selected, you want to know which angle is selected. So let's begin with this one, and I'll show you in a couple seconds. So what you want to do is click the first line and then click the second one and then place it in there, which is pretty easy to do. Just those two lines and place them. As easy as that. So, but you have to take note that by using these lines, they become part of the drawing, and you don't want to delete them, because when you delete them, the dimension will disappear. So essentially you want to embed this into your drawing, so you can just get the lines and make them blend into the drawing such that they look like part of the drawing. You know what I mean. The other is, what if you wanted to measure this outside part? For example, currently you can click, if it's a wall, you can click the first wall, click the second wall, and put it inside. Just wait for the inverted Y, just click there, and then on the next one you click, and then you place the third click would be where you want to place the dimension. But then what if you wanted to measure the other way? So you can click here, and then you click here and there and place on the outside. Wait, 225 is 360 minus 135. Oh God, I'm really that bad at mathematics, but I think that is it. So you have that, and that will be the same thing elsewhere. So that's how you dimension the angles on the outside and on the inside. And that leads us to the final tip. Dimensioning a section. So you want to have a section created. Let's use this very project that we have just completed. And if you haven't followed this series to see how we created this amazing house, you should go to my previous videos and watch it. So once this is up, we can dimension the elevation in two ways. One is the previous way that we have been dimensioning. So all you have to is to make sure this is selected. Of course, we need to change from the angular and put it in the orthographical, and click the points. Just choose where you want the dimensions to be, and double click and place them outside, which would be the same anywhere else that you choose to put the thing. But of course if you have such issues, make sure that you move away such that you can get where the thing behaves more naturally. Now one more thing that we can look at specific to the elevation is you want to use this height marker, such that if you hover over here and click, it is going to select all these. But maybe for the height of my house, I don't even need this dimension, maybe this one also. So you can double click and place those and look at them. That's how you place them. If you wanted to add any other point, of course you can select these and you can add a point. So you can add control click to add that point, and maybe for this one you can decide that it should be upside down. You can decide that this one is measuring from beneath, this other one is measuring from above. So there you have it. Those are the 7 tips that you need to be able to dimension in Archicad. Hit that like button if you like this one, subscribe if you haven't. You can drop down in the comments which one I have missed or which one you like of these, and I will see you in the next one.